All right, welcome back to week number 8 and 220. This week is going to be somewhat similar to last week, in which I'm going to take both of our lectures and put them on the same PowerPoint. And that first part, dietary transitions and globalization, I'm just going to introduce some basic broad concepts and really challenge you to read those two chapters and relate that to nutritional anthropology and globalization. And then I'm going to look at overnutrition in a bit more detail and provide you some new material and new context that's going to complement the chapters you read on overnutrition. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into detail on dietary transitions and globalization, but I want you to think about this in the context of our course so far. We have already read a few chapters that touch on aspects related to dietary transitions and globalization. And specifically, like all the way back in week number 1, we talked about ethnic foods in Laos. And we read about food and changes happening in places around the world, for example, in India. And when I took this course many years ago from Darna Dufour, who's the editor of our book, she used to introduce this topic by talking about a movie that came out a while ago and she really liked. It's called The Gods Must Be Crazy. And you might have heard of it. If not, we've got a weekend coming up, and maybe you have Netflix and check it out. It's a really funny movie, and it's actually related to our course. It's taking an aspect of food and looking at how it changes culture, dietary transitions, and more specifically globalization. But that's just a movie ultimately, and the reality is that hunter-gatherer societies like the one featured in that movie are basically gone. Now there are still hunter-gatherer peoples, but they are no more isolated. And people that were traditionally hunter-gatherers now live increasingly in cities and towns. They're involved in local economies because they're sucked into the global economy. And a lot of the lifestyles that we've read about have become increasingly rare due to this process, globalization. And the result is that diets have also become increasingly similar. Think of it this way. You probably don't produce your own food. You probably buy food. And worldwide, people that are producing food on a local scale are being pushed out of the farm by large-scale factory farming because they're simply better able to corner the market and sell food cheaper to undercut prices. They have the crops and the financial stability to weather global trends in both the market and in regards to actual weather, climate change. And what's driving those market trends is you, me, us, and particularly Western culture and fast foods. I mean, you can go anywhere in the world almost and find a fast food chain. What are the consequences in regards to culture, to the environment, to human biology as a result of these trends? And the question of how this even came to be is really a question of history. Not even 500 years ago, people around the world had to produce food for themselves, for the community. And that was a matter of survival for you, for your village or town. Food systems in that kind of a local context developed within limits, cultural limits, ecological limits. And what I mean is if most people could not digest dairy as an adult, or there was difficulties or reduced ability to digest dairy, then dairy products were probably not a significant part of that food system. Or maybe you raise different varieties or grow different varieties of potatoes so you can maximize nutritional quality, because different varieties have different nutritional qualities and tastes. And that means that you're also maximizing survival, because some varieties are more drought tolerant and others are less drought tolerant but maybe more rain tolerant. Now, at the local level, these are insurances that you and your family and your village are going to survive. And that local independence began to change with exploration and trade. You had the European or Western explorers that were trading and bringing back foods or products like potatoes and spices or tea or coffee or chocolate. And these were all initially rare items. They weren't common foods. They weren't foods accessible by people of lower socioeconomic statuses. These were exotic foods. They were the foods that only the rich or the elite could afford. But there was demand, which means production, and exotic foods became more and more available to middle and lower classes. And then trade would continue. And it's not just with exotic foods, but with all kinds of foods, dietary staples. And today it's not just with dietary staples, but with dietary symbols and ideologies. The 2 chapters that you get to read in this section of our book focus on 2 basic processes, which I've defined here. First is delocalization, which is the process of disseminating food varieties, production methods, consumption patterns throughout the world with an ever-increasing and intensifying network of socio-economic and political interdependence. And commoditization, which is basically a part of delocalization, the use of agricultural goods for sale rather than for local or family or home consumption. A la last week, let's move on to something that can be much less fun to talk about, but incredibly important: overnutrition. Now, overnutrition is actually related to undernutrition in a way. We didn't talk about the relationship between overnutrition and hunger, but there is a relationship there, and we'll talk about that briefly in regards to the U.S. First, overnutrition. What is that? You should be able to define these terms. It is an excess intake of nutrients, but it's not nutritionally adequate or balanced in regards to expenditure. Also, keep in mind that earlier in the term, we touched on the prevalence of obesity and overweight here in the U.S., let alone globally. And I gave you a link in one of our weekly news articles for you to look at some of these maps around the states. The maps that I have here on this screen show you an increase in the prevalence of obesity in U.S. adults between 1995 and 2010. Now you can go back to that article link that goes over obesity and overweight in the U.S. Based off of 2014-2015 data, and you can see that it's continued to increase. Even though here in the U.S. we are often so preoccupied with our body image and often with weight loss, but the prevalence continues to be high. And in the last 20 years, 25 years, as you can see, obesity has increased in all states, in all genders, in all sexes, in all ages, in all races, in all education levels. So what is the context? What is going on? There is an estimated 69% of U.S. adults that are considered overweight or obese, as defined, as you know, by BMI of 25 to 29.9 for overweight and over 30 for obese. Also, 32% of children, that is 1/3 of all children, 32%, between the ages of 2 and 18 are also considered overweight or obese. Now, remember, we talked about imprecision in the system briefly, and if you're interested in that, you can stop by the office and we can talk about that in more detail. but obesity in the US is nonetheless widespread, and the prevalence has increased rapidly in the last 40 to 30 years. And it's because of this rapid increase that we consider this an epidemic, and one that we find not just here in the US, but on a global scale. Globally, the human population is about 1.4 billion people that are overweight or obese, which is about 1 in every 7 or 1 out of every 7 households. And that should ring a bell to you. That should seem pretty similar to stats that we talked about just last week on hunger, because in many cases, this form of malnutrition, which is to say overnutrition, overlaps with hunger. Now, I'm not saying starvation, but with hunger. And the question is why? There are a number of factors that you can touch on. But ultimately, this relates to aspects of food transitions and globalization. And I hope that you keep that in mind, and you think about how these chapters build on each other. The increasing rates of obesity in countries around the world reflects a global food system and globalization of that system that delivers a lot of kilocalories, right? Energy density, but not necessarily nutrient density. Processed foods with added sugars, affordable foods, and culturally marketed products. Dietary transitions and globalization really only represent one broad aspect with several factors that relate to this global trend, or this epidemic, if you will. But there are many other factors involved here. And one factor that tends to get the blame, despite the fact that there isn't really any support for it, is genetic. And secondarily, epigenetics. Now, genetics by itself is very rarely a causative factor in overweight and obesity. But still, you hear this a lot from people, that I am the way I am because of my genes, that there's nothing that I can do to not be this way. But unless you're talking about a genetic disorder like Prader-Willi syndrome, in which it causes a person to have an excessive appetite, there is very rarely a genetic component, because even genetic disorders like Prader-Willi would come not just with an excessive appetite, but also have serious impacts to growth and mental ability. I think what people are mostly referring to when they want to blame their genes is actually epigenetics, because epigenetics is a factor in this trend. Epigenetics is the influence of environmental factors like diet and physical activity and culture and food systems and your family and food ideologies, and how these environmental factors affect genes and the expression of genes. Now that's maybe a concept that might be difficult to understand, and it might be new for some of you who are not involved in the sciences. But when you think about DNA, you tend to think about DNA like a template, right? And that's the way that we talk about it in our society, that it's like a mold in a factory. And say that factory is making a car or a car door, and you pour the molten metal or plastic into the mold, and at the end of that assembly line, you get that perfect car or that perfect door. And you can do this hundreds of thousands of times a day, and you always get the exact same model, right? The exact same door every time. And that somehow that's what DNA is like, right? That it's just making this end product because you have the gene for that. But that's not what DNA is, actually. That's not what DNA is. And we have to get away from thinking about DNA like it's a template. Think about DNA more like a script that is read. But you can read a script in any number of ways, right, without actually changing the DNA itself. So think of it less like a mold and more like a script. For example, Romeo and Juliet. That was a script that was pinned out, created by Shakespeare. But it's been read and interpreted in many, many different ways since that time. I mean, you have movies that came out in 1936 and 68 and 96 and 2013. There are ones that are cartoons with gnomes and with seals and etc., etc., right? All of these different interpretations. And that's exactly what the genetic code is and how it is read. It requires a change in our understanding and approach in terms of genetics. But epigenetics is a factor in terms of overnutrition, overweight, and obesity. And we'll explore that briefly in the next few slides. One of those environmental factors, eating and exercise habits in your environment, in a family, and how that relates to risks of chronic diseases like obesity and diabetes. Now, we have many studies that look at families, and in families where the parents exercise on a regular basis, which is to say 3 to 4 times a week or more, children are significantly more likely to also engage in regular exercise, not just when they are a child, but after they move out of the house, compared to families in which the parent or the parents do not regularly exercise. And in families where the parent or the parents might be considered overweight or obese, have difficulty in terms of overeating, spend more time watching television, children that grow up in that environment are also significantly more likely to follow that pattern, to spend more time watching TV, to spend more time on the couch, are more likely to be overweight, obese, or diabetic. The likelihood of a person becoming overweight or obese increases significantly if the parent or the parents or siblings are also overweight or obese. But it's not genetic. There's no gene for that. It is epigenetic. It is a result of the environment and the perception that comes with that. And as we are talking about the environment, that is the next factor. Obesity is on the rise. Now, there are no actual changes to people's genes, however, right? There's no real change in the gene pool. It's not like there is this gene and it's increased in frequency over time. Again, we want to say that genes are the cause, and we look for that. We tend to demonize or praise genes. Want to say that somebody is the way they are because it's their genes. But that's not how it works. It is our environment, and the way that environment can cause different expressions of genes. And if you remember the lecture from a couple weeks ago now, when we compared and contrasted the U.S. food system to the French food system, and that we grow up in this obesogenic environment. What does that actually mean, an obesogenic environment? Well, we don't only find that here. We find that around the world, and it's part of this global transition that is pushing that global trend in terms of overweight and obesity. All of those aspects of society that push us towards eating and reducing physical activity. And not just eating, but eating foods that are out of balance, that aren't necessarily the best for our bodies, especially taken out of moderation. So things like surplus of food, easy access to food, an increase in the variety of food, which also tends to result in people eating more. Energy-dense foods, processed foods, foods that are full of fat, which also tends to be very tasty, right? Larger portion sizes, snacking, or the frequency of snacking, quantities, food is available everywhere in some parts of the world, right? And in some parts of the US. And that's partially thanks to our fast food culture. I mean, literally, our highways, our roadways are lined with fast food restaurants, right? I mean, and think about that. Convenience stores, gas stations, all of these also offer snacks and fast food. Fast food is in our schools, it's in our shopping areas, it's in our airports. It is everywhere. And that means that you can get food, you can eat fast food at any time. And that means that we tend to eat more frequently than ever before. And that means more energy intake of food. And food that is energy dense. And that is large in terms of portion sizes. I mean, you buy that supersized meal because it's only 67 cents extra, and you get more Pepsi or Coke, you get more fries, which ultimately adds up to about 400 kilocalories more, and 36 grams of body fat, more body fat than you might get in the regular sized meal. Our serving sizes are up to 50% larger than serving sizes in other Western countries. And more than that, they are 2 to 8 times larger than they were here in the US just 40 years ago. Now, as you know, that coincides very well with the increase in overweight and obesity. As most of you are doing that energy balance project, you know that there is another side to that equation, physical activity, which we've also talked about. Our environment requires very little exertion. We have escalators to carry us upstairs, and we often tend to use them. And in some cases, we don't even have a choice. We have elevators to take us up flights of stairs, because we don't want to carry all of that luggage or whatever. We use cars to take us everywhere. We have a remote control for so many things, so we don't have to get off of the chair or the couch or the floor and turn something on or off, or up or down manually. There is, in other words, a reduction in physical activity. Okay, there is one more topic that I want to touch on, and I'll do this also briefly, and that is the obesity paradox. This is hunger and obesity. These two things, which you might think are conflicting or on opposite ends of the spectrum, often coexist side by side within the same population, within the same household, within the same individual. Now, how can that be the case? If hunger would seem to imply an inadequate food intake, but obesity implies an excess intake. Now, the highest rates of obesity often occur in populations living in the greatest poverty, in developed countries anyway, or countries that have a clear obesogenic environment. Hopefully you've done the readings and you know that one of our articles, or book chapters more appropriately, touches on this. In some areas, health food stores, or healthy food in general, like fresh fruits and vegetables, these are not typically available in lower income or rural neighborhoods, or in certain parts of a city. You might get supermarkets that have canned foods and sodas and chips, which aren't necessarily healthy. And in many places in the U.S., like around Native American reservations, or in low-income areas in a city, or in rural areas, there might not even be supermarkets that are available nearby, even in the middle of a city, right? But what is nearby are all of those fast food and convenience store chains that line our roads. I mean, you can always find a McDonald's or a KFC or a Taco Bell. Neighborhoods or communities that are characterized by this limited access to nutritious, nutrient-dense, and affordable food are called food deserts. With that limited access to grocery stores that carry fresh fruits and vegetables and a variety of fruit and vegetables, people obviously fall short of meeting dietary needs. Now, if you remember from our video documentary, fruits and vegetables tend to cost more than the energy-dense foods that can lead to weight gain. Foods like pizza and hamburgers and donuts, etc. These provide a lot of energy and that feeling of being full, right? Satiety. And they do so for less cost. In other words, these low-quality foods provide more energy in kilocalories, but fewer nutrients and for less money. However, the higher quality foods deliver fewer kilocalories, but more nutrients, a more balanced diet, but they tend to cost more. And that is partly related to our consumer choices every time we go to the supermarket, every time we go for food. That means that food deserts are a form of food insecurity. Now, if you provide nutrient-dense food, not energy-dense, but nutrient-dense food to families, to individuals that experience food insecurity, you do not get an increase in obesity. You get a decrease in overweight and obesity. Lowering the cost of fruits and vegetables is one incredibly effective and fairly easy way to improve diet quality, which depends on demand and marketing. So we're talking about global and food trends, but trends that you, again, influence. We are almost done with the class. When this course is over, and when the term is over, right, you're going to go into the next term and into the summer, and you might just go back into eating whatever you normally eat. And maybe that happens to be snacking on junk foods and fast foods and chips and nutrient poor foods rather than fruits and vegetables. And if that's the case, and if you continue to buy those foods, then nothing will change. And that sets up our lecture for next week fairly perfectly, in which we're going to focus on solutions. But let's end there for this week. And again, just a preview for this week and next week. This week we had our 2 lectures in one PowerPoint, looking at some very basic aspects of dietary transitions and globalization, and focusing more on overnutrition, just to supplement your readings. Again, you've got several readings, the news articles, and the book chapters. And the graded element for this week is our discussion. You have the first critical thought post due by Wednesday, and the 2 response posts to other students' critical thought post due by Friday. We haven't had a chance yet to discuss our documentary. We've had a number of book chapters and articles. Bring those reactions, those thoughts into our discussion, and I'm really looking forward to that. Next week, we have a few more articles and book chapters. The lecture is going to focus on solutions, policies, and problems. We have our last quiz number 4, next week, and we have our last progress paper, your 3rd final project progress paper, due next week by Friday. And last but definitely not least, I am giving you fair warning. Now, our course is an online course, and it is highly interactive. So I'm going to incorporate some DVD-style Easter eggs, 3 of them, over the next 2 weeks. I'm not going to tell you where they are. You're going to have to find them yourself, but they're there to benefit you if you are being engaged, if you're engaged with the course and the course material. So keep your eyes and your ears and your minds alert, keep engaged, in other words, and let the search begin. Well, next week anyway. We'll see you next week.